and welcome to the Moving Forward Talk Show. I'm your host, Jennifer Collins, along with my friends, Emily and Christy. We have with us a very special guest, Naomi Wright, founder of Be Emboldened Ministries. Naomi is a friend, and I very much look forward to addressing a topic near and dear to all of our hearts, how not to end up with a cult. Also for your kids, if you have any. So that's our topic for tonight, but also the main event is just having Naomi with us. And Naomi, I would love to have you introduce yourself and tell us as much as you want about your background and where you are now, that sort of thing. Go right ahead.
Sure. So I'm excited to be here. It's fun to hang out with y'all. I kind of feel like I should be sitting here with a fun beverage, but maybe that's not allowed. I don't know. Maybe that's a separate episode that needs to happen if it hasn't yet. But happy to be here. And my connection in meeting any and all of you, specifically you, Jennifer, and getting connected with you is related to my upbringing. So my dad was a pretty decent splinter off of the message. He had stepped into a polygamous lifestyle, and that got him kicked out of some of the churches he had been associated with, connected with the message. And so he kind of started his own home church version. So we didn't have like a building and all of that, as many do, met in different homes and things. So I grew up in that group, was not told it was part of the message. I grew up just being told I was Christian. So I didn't have that association growing up. I realized more just honestly over like the past 5 years, kind of more of what those connecting points are, but didn't grow up with that association in my own mind. So grew up in that, went to public school, had that whole mess of kind of living this duplicitous life and like keeping things hidden, and, siblings were cousins and things like that. When my dad passed away when I was 21, stuff started to unravel more for me. And then my mom passed away when I was 25. And that really sent me on a journey of figuring out what's actually true. Because while there were a lot of things that had been put on the shelf, so to speak, my parents were not supposed to be able to die. That was a part of the theology I was raised with. And that's a really tough one to reconcile when you're taught that people can't die and then they're dead. That's just not a super easy one to come back from. So that sent me on this journey of really seeking, landed into some other situations along the way, got a master's in social work and became a licensed mental health professional, as well as ended up going to seminary, which was really huge for me specifically. Definitely not something everyone needs to do after coming out of a cult, but I learned well in a classroom. It worked for me. And so it was really great for me to be able to have that opportunity. So I ended up getting a master's from Denver Seminary, and ended up putting both of those things together along with my lived experience and founded an organization called Be Emboldened back in 2020. And I started just on sharing my own story, which is kind of a trauma of its own to come out and go public, especially with family members still in and knowing that there would be more losses to happen. And yet I felt like within my Christian worldview that I hold now, which I identify as being Christian, I felt like I was just like, I need to share what's been done for me. I mean, my life is so different, and I felt so isolated in it though, because I still hadn't really told anyone about it, even close friends that I had for a long time. And so it's still this area that I would filter when I would have conversations with people, just like I did when I was a kid. And I'm like, I just can't live this way forever. And yet it was terrifying to actually talk about it. Moved forward, though, started Be Emboldened. It's now been 4 years since it was founded, and we offer a bunch of different services. It's been really incredible to see the growth and be able to, I just meet the best people, including all of you. It's just truly the coolest opportunity to get to come alongside and meet within different contexts. And so we offer a variety of services, from one-on-one mentoring services and group services to a monthly subscription where people can gather virtually and have, credentialed facilitator, and digital courses. We've got our Rebuilding After Religious Abuse. We have 2 new series that are already in their final stages of editing and coming out. We're announcing our first in-person conference next year. We've got a virtual workshop coming up at the end of September. So just a lot happening. We're starting to resource churches with a collaboration we're launching in October. So a lot of different needs that we're recognizing and, starting to build more and more resources to be able to serve others.
Oh, wow. There's a whole lot in there to unpack, Naomi. First of all, congratulations on 2 master's degrees. That is fantastic. You may be the only person I know who has earned 2 master's degrees.
It's expensive.
Yes, I'm a little bit
Oh,
envious because I love learning, and I'm also like you very comfortable in a classroom. But yeah, I don't know. I don't necessarily see myself in a classroom again necessarily. So, but I would like to give Emily and Christy both an opportunity to respond to that. And if either one of you would like to be first, raise your hand or wave your hand or something like that.
It's really great to get to talk to you, Naomi, a little bit. I know that your experience in the message and with the message is way different than ours. And so I think it's a good addition to the conversation when we talk about like experiencing cult life and how to avoid being in a cult. So I'm looking forward to hearing your perspectives on those things. I think it's going to be a good addition to what we're trying to talk about today.
And I think the what you have to offer, I admittedly come into this not knowing a whole lot about what you do, but looking at your website today and hearing you talk, I think what you offer people coming out of a high control group is very important, because sometimes when you come out and you're not purposeful and you're just kind of wandering from one thing to another, or someone with good intentions is trying to help you rather than, you're having someone who's educated, licensed, and going to come alongside and guide people and help them and not hurt them, hopefully. So I appreciate that, because I've kind of, I see women who want to leave often struggle, and I think they need guidance because they've been told they're nothing, they have no value. And so having someone that is willing to, with the lived experience and the credentials, to come alongside of them, I think that's really admirable. And I look forward to hearing more about that in this hour.
yeah. Thanks for the warm welcome.
Oh,
Yeah.
you're so welcome. And it would not be good to go forward without letting you talk a little bit about where you are now, your family, anything you'd care to share.
Yeah. So I've been married for 11 years here soon. And I know I was mentioning that my husband is actually a big fan of the show. And I didn't know until Jennifer, we were trying to meet up. I know it ended up not working out, but it was because of that he actually came out and told me. It just hadn't come up in conversation. I don't think he was hiding it. But he brought up, he's like, oh no, I'd really wanted to talk to Jennifer about the show. Like, I've been following along. I've listened to all the episodes, and it's just, I really love it. Like, it's really good. I was like, oh my gosh, I got to pass that on your behalf. I got to tell her this. So I thought that was really sweet. So yeah, married to Michael for almost 11 years. We have one little guy named Blaze. He is 6, almost 7. He'll be 7 at the end of the year. And yeah, just figuring out how you do all that. That's what it is. How do you do the raising a kid? And I've got very furry fluff ball. Oh, can I introduce you?
Yes,
Oh, we'd
please.
love to see your fluff ball.
Meet Solomon Butter.
Oh, nice
Solomon
kitty
Butter
cat.
is fantastic.
He's so big and fluffy. So, and sometimes he's the highest maintenance of us all. Depends.
That's how cats operate.
Right. So
I think it's so cool that Michael likes our show. I think maybe we should give a nod out to those who might be husbands of someone who used to be in a high control group and wondering, what is she thinking? Why? What has she gone through that makes her tick this way? Because you can get, 3, 4 different reactions, different approaches, different ideas, things we've gone through. And I think, kudos to him for being the kind of guy who wants to understand, because that's awesome.
I think it's great. Yeah. I'm sure he's not the only one, right? So I'm sure you've got other guys who are tuning in and like, okay, give me some insights.
Definitely. I ran into one in the local gas station, and he's like, oh, I heard you. It was when we did the launch with John on his show. And he's like, oh, are you Emily? I heard you. And I'm just like, okay, I think I know this guy. And he was, he's in the neighborhood, and he knew my parents, and he was in a high control group and had history, and, with his family. Yeah, he was listening and interested. And I was just blown away. I'm in a local gas station, not advertising that I'm coming and starting this podcast and being a co-host, because, small community, family around, stuff like that. And I was just blown away. So I think we have a lot of gentlemen listening, some to learn and then others to write snarky comments. So, we welcome them as well.
Always. Always. Yes. What would the web be without that,
Right. Uh-huh.
Oh my goodness. So that kind of brings us to a little bit more of a serious tone, I feel like, because, we do want to talk about how not to end up in a high control group. And here's Emily running into a guy at the gas station who used to be in a different high control group. And I think that, if we're real honest about it, there are lots of high control groups out there. Not all of them are religious, but many of them are. It's, moving from one church to another, from one city to another. We want to be careful. We want to be cautious. We want to pay attention because we don't want to accidentally sort of blunder into another high control group like the one we've already escaped. So and that's kind of the impetus behind this show, is trying to figure out, why do people join high control groups, and how can we avoid letting that happen to ourselves or to our children? How can we teach our children so that they don't end up in the same spot we found ourselves in? Because I know my parents were not dumb people. My parents were very smart. They would not have just blindly followed anyone. They really, there were reasons behind why they chose the lifestyle they chose and why they went into the group that they went into. And I think that would be the same for every single person who went into that group. So that's kind of where we want to go with this show. And it's a little maybe more serious than what we have been, but I'm hoping we can find some laughs along the way, because if we can't laugh at the crazy stuff that happened, we might just have a really rough time in general, not just tonight.
Yeah, I think that this idea that that people that join cults are not smart, and that they've been tricked or hoodwinked or somehow taken to the cleaners, so to speak, like they don't have the wherewithal within themselves to avoid the trap. And I think that that's a really bad presentation of what happens for a lot of people that end up or find out that they are in a cult or have been a part of a cult. They were raised in it. They didn't have a worldview outside of the group that they were in. And for people that join, it's often in a place of vulnerability for them. And for some people, it is about not having all the pieces. The cults don't advertise themselves and come out and say, hey, this is a really unhealthy spiritual community. Would you like to come be a part of this? Like, that's not how it's presented. And there are a lot of like gates along the way that until you get into the know, until you get to a certain like comfort level within the group, you don't know the details of what it is that you supposedly believe. And then once you figure that out, there's like this cost associated with backing out and choosing against the group and going against the group. So for anybody who has found themselves or like listens to this episode and is like, oh, I think I might be in a high control group right now, or this sounds really familiar. This isn't saying that there's anything wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with somebody who ends up in a cult. There's lots of reasons why it happens. It happens to people across the spectrum. It happens to extremely intelligent people, just as easily as it happens to young kids. It's an indiscriminate system that's just trying to feed the beast. It's trying to get your money. It's trying to get your attention. So that's something I wanted to add so that, you know.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, because everything you said, I agree with 100%. And I apologize if anything I said made it sound like I thought somebody would be naive to go into a cult or anything like that.
Of course
it's
not.
I think we have to try to build, I want to say boundaries or skills, maybe, you know, to help us find healthy places to spend our lives and healthy places to fellowship. So Naomi, do you know of any commonalities or, and maybe the question's more of a how than a why, when I think back to my parents and their story of their conversion into following our high control group, I would say probably there was more of a how there than a why. They probably didn't think, oh, well, because of this, this, and this, I think I will become a part of this group here. So, but Naomi, do you have anything to add to that conversation?
Or why or how people get involved, or the why?
Either one, whichever you'd like to address first.
Yeah, well, I'm going to start with Christy, what you talked about with people, just they don't get all the information up front. And that's different from, you sit down and have coffee and you're getting to know somebody. I would actually tell people like, hey, we're going to start with chit chat. We're not going to just start with our deepest vulnerable statements and share that with a stranger. And so this is different than that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people intentionally withholding information that they know would likely send the person running for the hills. Now, that's deceitful. And that's a problem. So when we're asking someone to come and check something out, we should be upfront about what we're asking them to check out. And I can feel this for myself. I wonder if this like resonates with any of you, where no, well, and I don't know everyone's background with like if you were totally in the message and didn't have any connections outside of it or not. But as someone who did, where I had both, I like had such a fear of being honest about anything that was going on at home. I needed to filter all of that out, and I had to keep it a secret because I knew that it could be really controversial. I knew that stuff was going to be a problem, and not just the polygamy aspect, which was illegal. Like that wasn't the only piece. There were other pieces to it as well. And so I just knew that I had this fear of sharing, and the fear in anything that's doomsday, of course, like those are just really good friends. Fear and doomsday go together. And I think that influences people being upfront. I don't know. Sometimes, depending on the group, there's more direct coaching of, okay, this is what you share, then we'll share this. And there's some groups where it's like very structured of like, we do this, then this, then this. And then I think there's groups like mine where, like I said, it's just this general like fear, people aren't going to get it. Like we're the real ones. And so they're just not. And so it would not super evangelistic. And so we can have different approaches, but the ultimate is the same. Like you're not being told what you're buying into, and it's intentional. And yeah, that's a huge problem. And I think that's an earmark in general, in conjunction with another aspect, Christy, that you mentioned with intelligence. Like it doesn't mean someone's weak. It doesn't mean that someone is unintelligent. Totally agree. In fact, particularly depending on the group we're talking about, like they don't want dead weight, so to speak. Like they want successful, high performing people. Like that's what they're wanting for their group, because they're wanting their group to grow and to thrive. And so there's some where they're, basically conducting personality tests on college campuses to see, is this the kind of personality we want or not? And if so, here's how we're going to go after it. And then combine that with different vulnerabilities that all of us have. There's nothing wrong with us having vulnerabilities. We all have them. It's just a part of being human. And when I say that, I mean an area where I could recognize, like, let's say in my 20s, when I lost my mom. So I lost my mom at 25. For years after that, and still, I would say very slightly now, but it's way less than it was. But definitely had a vulnerability of someone stepping in for me, like as a mom type figure, because I ached for that. I missed it so much. And that got me in a couple of pots of hot water, because it was not totally genuine. Like there was just a desire for control and kind of like, well, I want to pour into you. And it's like, well, what are you wanting to pour? And I didn't ask good enough questions. I hadn't learned to do that yet. And so then I would wind up in a situation where I'm like, gosh, I got really hurt by that person. And so that was a vulnerability for me. And then I recognized it as one, though, of, hey, there's nothing wrong with me. And there's nothing bad or wrong, again, about me having this vulnerability, but me recognizing it is helpful, because then I can slow way down. I can ask good questions. I can really take my time. I can just have this awareness that's going to influence my relationships moving forward in a way that's going to help keep me safe. And so that's a conversation I like to have with people too. Like, what are those vulnerabilities that people have? kiddo going off to college, naturally going to have quite a few vulnerabilities because they're kind of uprooted and getting started on their own for the first time. And that's an incredibly vulnerable time. And so, yeah, someone absolutely could invite them to something new. They're open-minded. They want to meet new people. And all of a sudden they find themselves in something. So lots of different ways that this can look, but something that I would offer for anyone who's tuning in is to consider, like, where are those vulnerabilities for you? Definitely don't need to broadcast them and tell everyone, but for you to be aware of, and then slow down with anything connected with that. So I'll go ahead and pause there, but those are some initial thoughts based on what you shared, Christy.
Yeah, I thought that was on point. I would, in talking about the whys or the hows, I would say that when my parents were recruited sort of into the high control group they were a part of, they were college students, and they were very serious Christians. They wanted to do right. They wanted to raise their family properly. And so along comes this high control group that claims to have all of the answers, and it just looked very attractive. So, and I will say, we definitely were brought up with a very clean lifestyle. So, if that was the goal, if that was the only goal, it would have been okay. But there were, of course, lots and lots of drawbacks to that as well.
I trying to think too. So I have been doing some more like information gathering on like, how did my dad wind up here? Just with the pieces that I had. So like my grandfather's a published author. I was able to get my hands on a couple of his books and read those. And he had been a pastor in rural, country, like little white steeple, church and stuff. And I'm like, and he had issues, but his theology looks sound from what I've read, again, because I've read some of his books now. And I'm like, well, he was a mainstream denomination. And so kind of trying to piece this together, like, how did this come to be? Because then my dad's two of his siblings ended up in the message as well for a while. I'm like, how did all this happen? And I think sometimes there can be a desire for something different than our parents. And I think that was the case for him of like, well, for him, it would have been, well, dad goes out and preaches this, and then he comes home and beats us, because my grandfather was also very abusive. So I don't want anything to do with that, but I still believe in God, and then gets introduced to something that is hyper charismatic, has a different, intrigue to it. And wow, okay. And that's pretty normal, like within the realm of just teenagers and 20 somethings in wanting to check out stuff that is different for whatever reason. So I think of that too, like that can come into play again, especially going back to like when you had mentioned, Jennifer, like having our kids maybe be equipped of different isn't necessarily better or good. It may be neutral. It could be better, but again, like slowing down and really like asking those questions and tuning into any kind of like hesitation that we feel. I know in the message, I was not taught to pay any attention to anything I felt. Anyone else? No. Yeah. Feelings? No, don't listen to those. To which I would respond to someone claiming Christianity. Well, what is conviction? Is that a thought or is that a feeling? Okay, so let's consider that. We don't want to shut down all of our feelings. Our feelings can tell us a lot of good things. If you're walking in the dark at night and you have a feeling that you're unsafe, please listen to it. Please go someplace else. Please get in your car and drive away. So yeah, we don't want to ignore all of our feelings. They can tell us a lot of important things, and they're a part of what makes us human. They are intrinsic to being human. And I believe I was designed to have them. So do they have the final word on everything? Not necessarily. Sometimes, depending, because they can be right. But yeah, so I'm sorry. I'm rabbit holing on this emotion thing, but it gets me. So, but paying attention to if you're feeling like something just feels off. And we can be so quick to rationalize that of, oh, well, it's just me. And even now it could be like, oh, well, I've survived something. I'm just being triggered. Well, maybe I'm being triggered because my brain recognizes that this is similar and I actually need to get out of here. So yeah, like paying attention to that and at least saying, I'm not going to ignore this. I'm maybe not going to totally lean into it, but I'm at least, again, I'm going to slow way down and I'm going to proceed with serious caution and I'm going to really check this out. So not to ignore those feelings that we have. They could be saving us.
So I think one thing when you're talking about asking questions and proceeding with caution, I think that's one thing that high control groups try to have you not do. We were taught asking questions is of the devil. Judas, he asked questions, other people ask questions. That's only from the devil. Have faith and believe. You start out the sermons, only believe. The pastor, I asked my dad, how do I know that, this is the right thing? I had heard about the Jehovah Witnesses and other people and said, they say they're all right. And how do we know that we're right? And he's like, well, you were born into our family and you just have to trust and believe. But I find it interesting that one of the first times that we find Jesus in the temple, he was traveling with his family, disappeared, and they found him 3 days later in Luke 2:46. They found him in the temple, sitting with the teachers, listening and asking questions, is what the Bible says. So I think it's interesting. Jesus sets a role model for us for asking questions. And then later on, when Paul and Silas are in their ministry, they were talking, and the Bereans were there in Acts 17:11. And they heard Paul and Silas teaching, and they searched the scriptures daily to see if what they taught was true. So I think, for someone maybe sneaking a listen to this podcast and worrying about asking questions, I know there's more in the Old Testament. And if you look about, searching the scriptures so you can give account for your faith and asking questions and reasoning, it's all in the scripture, and God does not fear questions. So I think, in this discussion for someone outside, it's easy to say, ask questions, but for someone within it, asking questions can be terrifying, because in that question, now I'm telling myself, oh no, the devil has a small grip on my soul, and nobody wants that. So of course you're going to run away from that. So I think that's important to kind of address that in this discussion, because questions don't come easy for everybody, and I know they didn't come easy for me. But yet, ironically, my mother, homeschooling me, she always called me the why child, and she always encouraged me to ask questions and explore life around me. But like you said, introducing people to the group, I had a really good friend who I was super concerned about because she didn't know the message. And I went to the pastor and said, how do I share with her? What message book do I give? What do I do? Well, just invite her to church. Don't tell her about the prophet yet. You got to be careful when you tell somebody about the prophet. You got to wait for that. And I was years later going, if he's the greatest thing ever, why wouldn't you want to be shouting it from the rooftop about the prophet, So I think that's just kind of, when listening to your talk, those were kind of some thoughts that were mulling around in my head.
Yeah, for what you were saying, Emily, when we were in the message, I don't know if this was true for all of you, but we were really hesitant to share with others because we were worried they would blaspheme. Like they would say something or think something in their heart and think, oh, that he's not a prophet, and then blaspheme the Holy Ghost, and then they are going to hell now. So we were cautious not to share everything with them just because their incredulity, like generally about the information we're sharing, might cause them some spiritual harm. So I think that's just a scare tactic that was used to keep us quiet.
Which is such a flip on the gospel, right? It's like, no, we're going to help protect people by not sharing.
Yeah.
I think intrinsically, we knew that some of the stuff we believed was so far out there, people would recoil from it. Yeah. I mean, I know in one of our support groups recently, someone shared a bulletin board that is in my neighborhood that talks about what really happened in the garden. And people there were aghast because they said, why would you pull out the racist, anti-biblical doctrine that is easily disproved and put it on a bulletin board? And it's beyond me, because that was the last thing I was going to tell anybody. They had to be fully persuaded that William Branham was the prophet, and that everything he said was true before I would bring that up, because it's pretty far-fetched when you go down that path.
And creating squirrels, the creating squirrel thing, like we just don't share that piece, you know?
How do we know? Test the spirit. How do we know? He made squirrels.
He made squirrels that no one ever saw. Yeah. So, I mean, personally, I was so bought into everything he said was true that it never crossed my mind it might not have been. I was pretty far down the path of thinking he was a regular person, at least, and not a prophet of any sort. And whenever I realized he had lied about the way he got his text for the sermon about the thinking man's filter that was on a cigarette pack, I was blown away. I mean, that was that at that point I realized the longer that I looked at his sermons under a microscope, the more big problems were going to just fly out in my face. It was unbelievable. But when you're in there, and I think that's the case in any high control group, you give way too much credibility to whoever is supposed to be in charge, whoever you're supposed to be following. You give them way too much credibility. And there's some of that in mainstream churches too, unfortunately.
Yeah, especially as women, our deferment to male leadership is so ingrained in us from such a young age that like our pastor is leading us, our fathers are leading us, our dads are leading us, our husbands are leading us, that we kind of feel, if we do have those feelings of doubt, like maybe there's something wrong with us. Like all the men in our lives are all these like, you know, spiritual giants are fine with us, and they understand it and they get it. And maybe we're less spiritual than them. Maybe that's why it's not making sense and why it's not resonating with us. So Naomi, how do you recommend people start finding that strength of character and strength of like spirit to say, no, what I feel is legitimate and I need to give voice to it?
Overall, that's definitely a journey that takes time, but you said to start. And so I think some things to start are, one, to reiterate what I already said about starting to just have awareness of what you are thinking and feeling, and allowing yourself to think and recognize that you're feeling something, just starting to have some of that. I know when I first, I would have been early 20s, it's probably like 24, 25. And I started dating this guy who really wanted to know how I felt about things. And I mean, I had never been asked that. Like, I mean, it's just like, at least not with any sort of like real intentionality and like desire to know. And I remember he'd ask me, and this happened several times when we first started dating, he'd ask me like, okay, well, how do you feel about that? And I would respond with, well, I think blah, blah, blah. And he'd be like, well, that's great. I appreciate knowing what you think. How do you feel? And I would just start crying. Like literally, I would just start crying. And I was like, well, apparently not good. Like, I don't know. Like, I was like, I don't really know what's under there, but like, obviously I'm upset. Like, I don't even know. And so it can really be a starting point just to like start to allow yourself to think or feel something. We're not even to the point of maybe saying anything yet, but just starting to have some sense of awareness of what's going on internally. And then really taking a look at, do I have good solid evidence for the stuff I've been taught? So if someone is coming out of, whatever, I'm going to go with like a pseudo-Christian kind of religion for the sake of our conversation right now, because that's where I would put the message, but other groups as well. A lot of groups that like use the Bible and twist that. Taking a look at a study Bible to start, because that's going to be helpful. And going back and starting to check, what does it actually say in here about me? Like, does it actually say this stuff? Like, is it in here that I'm a hog? Like, is that correct that that's the case? Oh, wait, no, it says that I was made in God's image. Well, is God a hog? I mean, what on earth are we saying here? So like starting to kind of think about those things and check. And the reason I say a study Bible is because inevitably when we go to the text ourselves, we're going to hear what we've been taught. We're going to read what we've been taught, because that's what we've been taught. And so a study Bible is really helpful because at the bottom, it's going to have notes that help give you context for what's being said. It's going to help explain it. So that's going to give you at least a starting point. Now, that may give you other questions of who wrote that and who. Happy to answer those questions. Feel free to send me an email, hello@beemboldened.com. Would love to talk about this more. But for the sake of our focus for now, start to go and see, like, I've been told all this stuff. Is it actually true? And if it's true, the Lord says, seek me and you will find me. I remember the first time I was walking into an actual like mainstream church and I was standing outside and I'm like, Lord, I genuinely am trying to find you. And if you're really not in there, please have mercy on me and don't smite me. And that may sound silly to some, but it's serious for those of us who are raised that could happen. And so it was a genuine fear that I had. I'm like, Lord, I'm trusting that what you say about yourself is true, that you are love, and that you, and all the stuff that love means in 1 Corinthians 13, I'm trusting this is true. I'm trusting in the truth of your character. And that means if I'm really genuinely trying to find you, you're not going to hurt me. You're going to redirect me and help me find you. You're going to make yourself known. And so if you go to the text with that heart posture of like, I just want to know if this is actually true, then unless the Lord is lying himself, in which case I would consider figuring out another faith system altogether, I'd get away from monotheism if that's the truth, then you're going to be okay to ask those questions and to investigate. And that's the journey that I went on, was just starting to allow myself to feel some stuff, starting to allow myself to ask some of the questions within my own mind, and then allowing myself to start to go check. Like, this is what I've been told. If it's true, it's going to shake out as being true. I mean, this is going to work out when I investigate.
Lots of good stuff there. One of the questions I was hoping to address is, what defenses can we give our children to not be so vulnerable to being recruited to a high control group? And certainly, Bible studies one. Emily, I liked what you said about your mom calling you the why child and encouraging you to ask those questions. Recently, we had a conversation in our own family where I told my husband, I feel like we didn't teach our children how to fight, because the two of us don't really argue. And if we do it out of the sight of the children. So they're never really exposed to conflict that then is resolved. And I think there's a culture, especially in Christian families, where you try to bring up your children to be respectful. And respectful doesn't always encourage questioning, certainly not rebellion and disagreement. And I think, there are ways to raise your children to ask intelligent questions and to not be afraid to disagree with you. And I think that's something I would do differently. Even though my children were quite young when we left, I think I would try to give them the opportunity to disagree with me. And, even vehemently if need be. Because I think that would serve them well in being a strong person and asking those kinds of questions in whatever setting they find themselves in.
Yeah, yes, that is probably best practice, Jennifer. But I will also say in some ways you dodged a bullet, because we are doing the latter and it's exhausting. And I know that it's good, but oh my word, the questions and the pushback and sometimes he makes good points and we change our plans. I'm like, that actually is the smarter way to go about it. And he's 6.5. Like, legitimately, I'm like, no, that's a good point. Okay. Like, we're going to change it. But about like everything, like just really wanting to get it. And I'm so glad that we're doing that. And yet just to give a comparison point, like, it sounds like we were all kind of in the same boat of not really being raised to ask questions. We weren't. I mean, at 6.5 years old, I'm getting questions like, how do I know I'm not praying to thin air? How do I know that the people who wrote the Bible didn't mess up? I mean, those are the kinds of questions that I'm getting. And it's just like, ooh, okay, 6-year-old terms. How do we break this down? How do we explain this? And it's good, but just imagine like the questions we all could have had. That's what it makes me think of, is what would I have been asking that I wasn't allowed to ask? And how different could I have turned out in that regard if I could have? I'm like, that's maybe a little depressing to think about, but I also think just like interesting to think about. I think it can speak to different personalities, of course, but what our children may have going for them naturally that we might not even compute they have going for them naturally because it was so stifled in us that we didn't even know it was a thing. And we had to work so hard to get it back then as adults. But they may already have it. And so we can just encourage it versus having to like teach it all. It's just like encouraging those attributes in them. And so that's been really neat for me to see, as well as, like I said, exhausting. But yeah, going on, Jennifer, just like other stuff, I want to mention one other thing, and then I'll hand it back over to you all. But I think also as the kids start to get older, so this might be like teenager years, while it's great to know, and it's so important, it's not just great, it is important for us to know why we believe what we believe. Like that is super important. I also think because there's so much to the Bible. I mean, we study it our whole lives if we're Christians. And so it's like, I think it's unreasonable to think that a teenager or a young 20-something is going to be able to catch any little twist when the groups can be so deceitful. So I also really encourage some general education on red flags. Like, what are the common theological and doctrinal red flags that are being used out there? What are the common issues with character that we're seeing in leadership out there? And giving them like, I have the goal at Be Emboldened of, we're launching a couple curriculums about this, but I want like a little pamphlet people can like fit in their back pocket and be like, that sounds interesting. Is this in here? And just kind of putting that pebble in their shoe about that, so to speak, of like, okay, something seems off. I know I heard something about that. I'm going to go back and check with mom and dad or whomever it was. And I think that's important too, because again, it's just a lot to be able to know. And so those rules of thumb and those common issues, again, those common threads we see pervasive across groups, I think can be really helpful.
Just kind of to piggyback on that, I know that knowing logical fallacies can take you a long way in being able to spot people who are trying to pull the wool over your eyes, or even just pulling wool that they have over their eyes, over your eyes too, because they're just repeating a logical fallacy that they bought into. But anyway, before we move on to primary tactics, is there anything else, Christy, that you wanted to say about child raising or?
Sure. I mean, one thing that I've tried to do with my kids, especially my oldest, she's 13 now, and I try to look at, I joined the message when I was 16. So it was just before my 17th birthday. I first went to a message church. Very vulnerable time in my life. What made it more vulnerable? Well, one of the big things is that my family, we went to a Methodist church, but we didn't discuss spiritual matters. I don't know exactly why my parents were like that. I don't know if they were just uncomfortable doing it, but I've always tried, and I think it's really important for parents, if you want your kids to have healthy boundaries spiritually, to open those channels of communication with you, and to give them a support system of healthy individuals to discuss things with, without judgment, without condemnation. They can come to you as a parent or another, respected, stable adult, and have conversations about spiritual matters, about personal matters, about matters of morality, anything that's bothering them, and that they can bounce ideas, they can figure out who they are within a safe community. I didn't have that. The first time I remember really talking about spiritual questions was inside the context of a message church. I mean, we went to Sunday school in the Methodist church, but outside of that, I didn't have a means of communication. I didn't have a language of communication for the big questions, because it just wasn't something that we did. So I've tried to give that to my daughter, especially since she's 13, and she knows she can come and talk to me about anything. And if she doesn't want to talk to me about it, we have trusted friends. I have other adults in her life that she knows that she could reach out to if she would feel more comfortable with another adult. So yeah, I think that's a huge part of it is setting up those lines of communication for your kids.
I like that. So you said, Naomi, when we were planning for this show, that we should become educated on primary tactics. Now, we are running short on time. We have about 6 minutes. So if you could give us, I don't know, maybe 5 primary tactics, a minute for each one, and then that would give us a minute to finish this off. But if that doesn't work, maybe we can have you back another time.
Ooh, okay. Let's see what I can rattle off. So some primary tactics, some things that I would kind of red flag, and not speaking to like doctrine only, like theological stuff only, or character stuff only. But one is, if you can't ask questions, that's a primary tactic is to shut that down, or to give some kind of like really contrite answer of like, oh, well, you'll understand, or, it'll be revealed to you, or whatever it's going to be. Like, it's like a non-answer answer. That would roll into that. Another one would be something that I recommend. This isn't necessarily a flag as much as it is a consideration. It can be a flag, but I would definitely, again, put it in the consideration category, is taking a look at what's called church polity, which is just really the structure of the organization. And if we see what I would put as a flag, which is a central leader, that is something to find out more about. Like, is there any sense of accountability? Do they have checks and balances? Are they just like yes men or yes women who are the checks and balances because they're all in like the central leader's back pocket? Do you get a sense of that? Like, are they all related? Have they all been friends since college? Have they all, or do we have like some real oversight going on? So that's something that is really important to consider. Yeah, a third one that I think will probably resonate with all of you is that there's a way to leave, and to leave well, that is reasonable. If it's an organization where anytime you hear that someone has left it, it's like lots of mudslinging and they're excommunicated and we need to shun them, or it's just, oh, they were awful and if there's like no way to just be like, no, I'm going to move from this gathering of the body of Christ over to this gathering of the body of Christ. Like, if that can't be done, that is also concerning. And so that's something that I would take a look at. If there's any discouragement of investigating things for yourselves, that is a flag. We're going to see, again, there's a whole list of what this can look like, but I think the theme that you might be catching as I'm talking is there isn't really freedom to be able to be a whole person. Like, there's just a lot of control going on, a lot of like heavy-handed, here's what you're supposed to do, here's how you have to do it. And we don't really get to have a lot of pushback. Again, when we're talking about high control groups specifically, you're just going to start to recognize like, wow, what freedoms am I losing? And are these backed well? And are they actually backed in scripture? So those are, again, just like a few thoughts to get us started, but there's a lot more that could be said there. So if we want to have a part 2, we could have a part 2.
We may hold you to that. And if we don't have part 2 in this season, we may have part 2 in our second season, which will be in 2025, because we have just started talking about having one season and then having a little hiatus and then coming back and starting a second season. So we'll definitely put you on the slate for our second season, Naomi. Did any of you have any final thoughts that you want to leave our listeners with before we close out?
I guess just ask questions and do a lot of research. When I hear a new speaker, teacher, pastor, whatever, that someone has put up on a pedestal, I like to go to Google and type in their name and type in the word cult afterwards. And if there's no hits, I go, okay, they must be pretty good. But if there's like a ton of hits, I want to sit down and read and go and look through the information critically and say, are there just a bunch of bitter people about this person, or do I need to actually pay attention and go, here's a giant red flag. If there's so many people writing articles that this person is not theologically safe, I need to steer clear. I know there's things that come through the church from time to time, different women's groups and different fad theologies that come through, and different pastors kind of leading the charge. And sometimes I'm just like, nah, that one's not for me. I don't need to jump on every bandwagon, and that theology is a little bit too, yeah, that's not biblical for me. So, and that's okay. We don't have to grab onto everything that everybody is, running with. I saw on Naomi's website, and I really appreciated this, that it said, oh, now I've gone off the website here. It said religious cults don't only exist off the grid. So I think it's important that these high control groups aren't just in a compound out in the woods with a big fence around it and, dancing around the campfire singing whatever song they sing, and it's super visible like Jim Jones or Waco, Texas or stuff like that. And that was some of the reasoning I was told when I was younger why we weren't the C word, because we didn't have that. We weren't the alien cult, drinking Kool-Aid, living in a compound all together. So I'm like, oh, okay, sure. Yeah, we're not that kind of group. But so I think that's a very important point, and even teaching the kids and the teens and those heading off to college that we're concerned about, it doesn't always look like what you see on the movies. It's very, very subtle.
Yeah, well, and thanks for bringing up Naomi's website. That's just beemboldened.com, right, Naomi?
Yes.
Right. And then you had said that a good email to reach you there is hello@beemboldened.com, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So if anyone's listening and they have questions about whatever related to this conversation, please feel free to reach out. Happy to get you connected in the way that would serve you best.
Well, it has been so good having you on the show with us, Naomi. Thank you for coming, and thank you to all of our listeners for listening. We hope you found our show both informative and helpful. Feel free to contact us at movingforwardtalkshow.com with any questions you may have or ideas for future shows. I look forward to hearing from you as we continue to demonstrate that life goes on and healing happens as you keep moving forward.